Okay, we're here looking at Imperial Elegy. This was a review copy. I had interest in it anyhow, but I think, wow, I hope I didn't just show my ass. I forgot what pants I'm wearing. I had interest in it, but I had made a decision that I wasn't going to keep reviewing these kind of Here I Stand based, and I knew this one was. It claimed to be, although it feels a lot less like it than other games that are based on Here I Stand. Here I Stand based multiplayer CDG type games. This is one of the most complex of the pile, or family or whatever, and it has a lot of different concepts in it, and it's a lot harder to assess the game state in it. Like I said before, back in the intro, this actually, I think, was more a matter of I shouldn't have that on. This was a game that, again, I didn't go out and request, but I think one of my players put me in, or one of my viewers put me in contact with the company because they really wanted to see me cover it. So, one or more. I know that at least a couple of people really wanted me to cover this because it's very much in my wheelhouse. Now, there's a couple of other games of the same period, and I will bring them up occasionally, or of the same topic. I'll bring them up, or a similar topic. Boy, I'm having trouble getting the words out, right? I will bring them up a few times here, along with some other games that this kind of reminded me of in certain ways. The two that it most kind of comports with are Pax Britannica, which is a long-time love of mine, but a very broken game, and Europe in Turmoil, which is a little closer to this, but it runs only in the immediate run-up to World War I, starting in 1900. So, this one, which starts earlier than PAX does, back in 1850, is covering a larger chunk of things. But why it's more like Europe in Turmoil is, first of all, you get to play out the war. You know, in more detail than you do in Europe in Turmoil. It becomes sort of like a whole separate game to play the Great War on it. And I think there's actually a scenario which gives you kind of the historical Great War and lets you like play that using this game. That's kind of an interesting idea, to be honest. And this goes into a much more detailed mechanisms for fighting out the war. Let us first talk about the components. And they're an interesting set. There's a number of different decks of cards. I've got them kind of wedged in here, so I'm not going to pull them out. The cards are very interesting in terms of texture, etc. They're really easy to shuffle. They seem to be much sturdier than things that are that easy to shuffle usually, but they're also very slick. Kind of reminiscent if you've ever used like plastic playing cards, the real plastic ones that, you know, they've got that same feel to them. I don't know if these are. They don't quite feel the same. They're very difficult to pick up, which is one issue, and they squirt out of, you know, if you're holding them and not really careful, especially with a big deck, and the main deck is rather large, they squirt out, and they can kind of make a mess that way and hit things and all kind of problems in that direction. I had a counter spill. I'm just making sure I didn't leave anything here as a last check. The the counters are, first of all, everything in this game is high quality. I mean, it's got an armored box, maybe not quite as heavy as the GMT ones, but much heavier than your standard in the game. The player aids are a fairly thick quality stock. You've got one per player. A lot of information on them. I didn't use them anywhere near as much as you probably would want to, but you know, you're definitely getting a quantity of good solid components in this. You've got a rule book and a playbook. The playbook, so the rules have issues. There's some 8 pages of errata for this game in the current version. The one thing I can say is the company seems to be willing to support the rules better than some of the other smaller companies that I've got, especially a couple of smaller European companies, but you know, a lot of smaller companies. They seem a lot more willing to support things, coming up with clarifications, coming up with online errata. I don't know if there's a living rule book. I didn't check for that because the errata seemed to be the thing I wanted. But they also seem intent on putting out a second printing where that errata is going to be in there. If the company does what it did with Knock Paris, they will be putting out a patch as well, but you'd have to buy that. The errata in the rule book, some of it's kind of significant. There's places where you have to pencil, if you're into penciling things in, if that's your goal, you can do it, even though it's a slick rule book. It actually takes pencil well enough, but there's not a lot of space to put stuff, and there were places where I just couldn't fit all of the errata there. Much more troublesome, I think there's a couple of counters that maybe have some minor issues with them. Like, I know I saw a couple of blank counters that had a strength point value on them for navies, and I'm assuming one of the naval squadrons or something did not have the strength points on it. Well, 2 of them. But I couldn't figure that. I couldn't find that, so I'm not positive about that, but there was something strange about that. There were a fair amount of blank counters. They're useful, you know. I ended up shoving them into with my general blanks. I did use a couple of blanks for a few purposes and was coming to the point in the Great War where I would have needed more. But most of the counters in the game are limited by counter mix, and those that aren't, you have a fair number of. I didn't find myself needing more. Let me think. Some of the cards have errata on them, and this is somewhat problematic because it's actually shows up on some of the most complicated cards in the game where there is just not room to put the additional information on the card. And I'm not even sure that if they did a reprinting that they could fit it without changing the size of the print on the cards, which is already relatively small. One thing about the counters that I didn't like, I was finding myself seeing counters that all kind of blurred together. In particular, I had special problems with influence and control markers and diplomacy and alliance, which had a color scheme on them that made me keep thinking everybody was France. And that actually led to a couple of places where I put wrong counters in places, one of which persisted to the end of the game. That's life. Let's talk about the dice. Dice are perfectly fine. There are situations where you're rolling one die against the other. I would strongly have preferred two different color sets of dice because of that. But you really don't need more than 4 dice. I had a bunch out there because I'm kind of weird about that. I'm going to put the dice aside because I prefer smaller dice for a game like this, and we'll just put the. I don't know. I keep collecting these. People keep making games with these larger, high quality dice, and I'm like, well, they're not really what I want to use for these. I don't mind, but. And I'm just not sure what I would use them for, though, to be honest. It's funny, I never steal the dice out of my more family games, like a game of Monopoly. I'll leave the dice in that all the time. But a game like this, look, I'm not going to play this somewhere kind of at random, right? Then again, neither would I Monopoly. I don't know. There are these stock pieces here, one for each country, which has a significant amount of the national capabilities on there. It has most of the information you need to play your nation, along with a bunch of tracks. There's not quite enough tracks, which is to say during wars you're going to have to share a track, but you can kind of put that on any one you like. It actually tells you to do that. Some spaces for holding events that you have in play, and your reserve armies, which aren't normally deployed to the board. You have to pay to put them on the board during any given war. And on the backs of these, I think between all of them, you have the setup for all the countries and all the miners on there, for what that's worth. This one doesn't use the back for anything interesting. This is a really weird thing that I'll go into details as I look into the game. It's one of the things I'm really not sure whether I like or not. You have another, again, this is really sturdy. This is board quality. This is for handling stuff during the Great War. There's information. You can keep your trench battles on this, and you can keep the U.S. and Italian information on here because they're not a given player. You could conceivably keep their information on somebody else's card as well. There's another aid quality, and again, this is fairly sturdy. I know it's flopping around, but it sounds nice when it does it. This is to handle the bot. Oh well, there's 2 copies of it. I didn't realize that. Okay, it's not as sturdy as I thought, but it's pretty sturdy still. I don't really like bots, so I didn't worry about that at all. But this is a game that you have to have 6 players for if you're not going to play with bots. And the bots are going to do weird and random stuff, which may be more damaging in this than it is in, say, Pax Britannica. Okay. The playbook, I don't even know really what's in the playbook. You got the setups for the different scenarios, and there's a fair number. Yeah, there's a historical Great War scenario. And then an alternate Great War scenario. Some examples. A bunch of this card descriptions, which isn't really helpful to play. They're historical information on all the cards. They don't give you any clarifications about the cards. At best, they don't even state the rules on the cards, but they give you some context on them. And then another card descriptions for the cards that are specific to the Great War. Again, giving you kind of a fair amount of what the design intentions were behind the cards, what they're reflecting, etc. There's a strategy pro, which is useful, I guess. It tells you things that I didn't note all that well. There's design notes. Now, the design notes are kind of interesting. They don't go into a lot of detail about the specifics of the different systems, but what's really awesome is throughout the rules, there are design notes within the rules. So while you're reading a particular rule, this reminds me of the old Victory Games way of showing things. The organization isn't quite as good. They put the design notes in little boxes within the rules. What I really loved was the old Victory Games thing where 2/3 of the page was the rules and 1/3 of the page was either examples or design notes. And that allowed you to ignore that section if you didn't want to read it. If you're looking for rules, if you're looking up stuff, that section wasn't where you'd focus. So it was really, really helpful for that. Instead, these follow a more standard, two columns on each page with just rules interspersed with play notes, design notes, examples, all kind of stuff kind of worked in, lots of color and stuff that, whatever. One thing that's very helpful is there's a full compendium of the national goals that each country has. This is important because as you're playing the game, other players are holding secret cards that are their victory points, and victory points are incredibly important in the game. I'm looking to see if it's the case. I think every player has a single 4-point goal. And there's something a little weird about this because Austria-Hungary has a second one, but its second one, I think it does. Nope. Nope. That's another 3-pointer. Its second one comes into play in scenarios that are later, if you don't play the full campaign, if you play at a later starting date. Death Grip. Okay, I got you. It's also got the home cards, which each player, again, has available to them pretty much every turn. So it would be very helpful to know exactly what those do. What it doesn't have is a compendium of all the... It does have a compendium of all the cards by name, essentially, but with historical information rather than what the card is actually going to do. So you can't, you don't have a study in the playbook that you can like look up what everything does and try to figure that out. But the things that players are keeping secret, which is their national goals and which home card they selected, when they can pick those every turn, those are all in the playbook. I want to talk about the rules, but I need to brew some more tea. So we're going to be back in a little bit, because I'm guessing I didn't do too bad, but I want to break for a bit. I'll be back. Okay. Let's start looking at the rules. This isn't a deep dive like the intro portion is. But I want to look at some of the major systems in the game. First of all, how the rules are actually laid out. There's a big portion on the components and what the different things are that are covered in the game. It jumps right to, hey, here's how you win, which is really kind of important in a lot of ways. And it's kind of complex. But basically, the main flow of the game, outside of the Great War, you win by achieving your national goals. You're going to get 3 national goal cards throughout the course of the game. And those are, you have one in your deck that's worth 4 points. If you don't draw that, that could be a disadvantage. The rest are worth a maximum of 3 points. Some of them are just binary. The 4-point card is like a 4-2 split, I think, in most cases. But then there are other cards that you gain points by being the best at. So, for example, having the highest stability. Whatever players have the highest stability will get 3 points. Wiping out any places behind them for ties, which means like if 3 people tie at the top value, nobody else gets any points. Second and third place will get 2 and 1 points if those are existing things. But, and this is a big but, not as big as mine, but if you do end up fighting a great war, things get a lot more complicated than just scoring these points. And so, some of those points can come from other things, other than your national goals. Trying to remember what they were. They were on the sheets. There is one other way to win the base game, and it almost happened in my game. Which is you can hit an automatic victory with anyone except Britain, I think. And don't worry, Britain's got enough advantages. If you get enough keys, basically. There are a lot of keys in the game, but if you get enough keys, and they might have to be territorial keys, which means they're linked to your home country, then you could win an automatic victory at that point. That is a very, very difficult goal. My French player basically did tremendously well throughout the game. Nobody could figure out how to really stop them. That's an issue. We'll get to that. That's got to do with something else. And they ended up, getting within 1 key of winning the automatic victory. That last key became very hard to take, though. I kind of blundered into being that close, even with people knowing that France was doing well. And once they kind of decided, okay, we got to stop them from being able to do that, it became possible, but difficult. And France was trying to get that last key, but they just couldn't arrange it in a way where they wouldn't be beaten up for trying it. If a Great War happens, though, the alliance that wins the Great War by the way, there's no tiebreakers in this game. So if multiple people get the same value, and remember, everybody's sitting on the same kind of cards. A single 4-point card and the rest max at 3. You got 3 cards. So you're looking at, can I get 10 points? Some of the players did. French did. But again, they did very, very well. But if a Great War happens, it screws the whole thing up. In general, the side that wins the Great War will win the game collectively. As long as, if you get knocked out during the Great War, though, like Russia historically was knocked out of the Entente, you don't win. Now, this isn't automatic, however. A neutral player who has more victory points than the players who won the Great War, than any of the players who won the Great War, any single player, at the time that the victory points are calculated, just before the Great War starts, will win. But the winners of the Great War get a bonus for how quickly they win the war, or possibly a penalty. So There's a strong value to remaining neutral. If the Great War doesn't end in a victory by one side, then a neutral player automatically wins, whoever has the most victory points. Now, if no one is neutral, and everyone therefore who's left is in the Great War, whoever has the highest stability wins the game. Which makes sense because their country is holding up the best during the Great War. They probably would actually win the Great War if you just kept playing it out. I do feel like the Great War may end a little too quickly in terms of timing. It is bounded by the historical 4 years that the war went, as opposed to having an option to go maybe a fifth year. I feel like that's probably acceptable. The national goals for each country are specific to the country. They're linked to what those countries historically wanted, to some extent at least. And it's quite possible for a couple of people to score maximal on them, I think. But one of the things is most of the national goals are going to be secret. There are exceptions to that. Both that I can think of are exceptions that are up to the player to take advantage of. The Germans have the capability to grab the German unification card. They want to unify anyway, but the German unification card's worth 4. They have the right to grab it in the first chance they have to look for national goals. They can't take they don't get any other choices, and they just play it face up in front of them, so everybody knows that they're going for that. So that becomes something that everybody's kind of interested in stopping if they grab that. France has one which is sort of a restoration of the Napoleonic glory, where they just want to take over some land. That one gives them bonuses if they play it face up, if they reveal that they have it. It gives them certain bonuses in in winning wars. And perhaps they'd rather keep it hidden. Because once you reveal that, then if you're close to that condition, everybody can kind of say, he's got his 4-pointer. He's a danger. The map is busy and complicated, and especially so when all the counters are on it. Okay, let me look through some of the other things here. So, unlike most of the games of the Here I Stand flavor, and I mean, sort of Rome maybe kind of belongs in that too. I don't tend to think of it as such, but in a lot of ways it's kind of close. It's a little lighter. Most of those, you can fight whoever you want, whenever you want. Something that I never considered really in that same flavor was Napoleonic Wars, where you have alliances and whatnot. You have to actually declare war. This game also has that kind of declaration of war, and I feel like this is much, much more complicated, and actually I kind of don't really feel it's straight in that Here I Stand variety. But if you like the more complex games in that flavor, say a Virgin Queen or a Tanto Monta, this may be for you. I shied away from both of those. I mean, I own them, I've covered them, I played them. I learned to like Virgin Queen more than I did before after like my third play. Tanto Monta kind of convinced me to make that third play because I found myself liking that more as I went. And again, as I worked my way through this one, there was a lot of frustration dealing with especially different concepts that this has. But I sort of warmed to it a little more, especially once we got to the Great War. Although I still made a lot of blunders of the kind that is very frustrating because I couldn't assess the full game state properly, and there were things that should, I felt, be obvious to me that I just didn't see, that allowed for very chaotic stuff to happen. And I think that's going to be a case when people play this for their first time or whatever, in a way that I don't feel like even the Virgin Queen Tanto Monta type stuff hits you with. I don't feel like the game state in the. I feel like the game state in this, misinterpreting it can really, really screw you over. For whatever that's worth. Let's look over some more stuff here. So, one of the concepts that's going to be key in all of this is nationalities. And you are going to, at times, want to, like Germany wants to unify Germany. Austria-Hungary has to worry about the nationalities that are within their borders. But in general, if you have minority nationalities within your borders, and Austria is the worst case of this, you're going to be facing potential revolts. Turkey also has a big problem with this, the Ottoman state. So that's something you're going to want to keep in mind, because those can become new countries, new minors, whatever. There's a concept of flashpoints, which are collections of territories generally that if you control the right amount of them, you're going to get a bonus, and that bonus is additional cards, which is essentially income in these games, right? There's an additional flashpoint, which is the naval dominance one, which requires you to have, and here I believe the game is actually wrong. The Brits, I think, have a point too many of that, from what I can tell in their line setup. In these cases, you don't get cards for them. You might on a given card play. Instead, you get a bonus on your industrialization rolls, which is a very important thing, because as your industrialization increases, your cards each turn increase. It also has effect on wars, which we'll get into, I guess. There are a number of special spaces in the game. Yeah. There's going to be a lot of special rules in this across the board, aligned to various nationalities. It's not all going to be covered in the cards and the home cards. If you think about Here I Stand, each country has like one special thing it has to worry about. Virgin Queen, it's a couple. Here, it's a fistful of them. To begin with, everybody's got a big section like this of special rules. But then there's additional special rules which didn't fit on there, which are in the rules themselves for these. Got the tracks here. Am I on there yet? I don't know. Okay. The player turn order is fixed every turn. It doesn't flow around. It's going to follow that standard procedure. You play a card. You have a choice. Do you want the ops points for it, or do you want the event? Exception being mandatory events, which give you both. You might not want the event there. There are funky differences. So, like, at some points, mandatory cards can be pulled from your hand, like when you're trading a card to someone, but when you're not allowed, one thing that you're not allowed to do is you're not allowed to play one of them in a war because it would trigger the mandatory event at the same time as the war, and that would cause issues, or could in some cases. There are spaces that are completely uncontrolled, which remind me of the Pax Britannica kind of unformed areas. They're things that you can go into with influence and then upgrade to, you just have to pacify them and upgrade them to a control marker. It feels very much like Pax in terms of that, even though the mechanisms are different. But then there's spaces that are minor powers that are neutrals, and those will be purple spaces that have a nationality flag in them for the most part. But there are spaces that can be broken, that can become minor countries if they have a nationality flag in them. It's not 100% true. A lot of the spaces that have a nationality flag in them can become a minor country. So there's two ways that you can try to control things. Uncontrolled spaces, the ones that are kind of the unformed spaces, those you place an influence in them, then you move a military into there, you pacify the area, you get control of it. An area that's a minor country, you can place a diplomacy marker in it, which doesn't really do anything except it makes it possible to upgrade from diplomacy to an alliance. It's an expensive upgrade. And then the alliance means, until the Great War, that minor is willing to join in your wars. And any attack on that minor is an attack on you. In order to fight either a minor or another major power, but not uncontrolled spaces, you generally are going to need to go to war with them. And there's a whole fairly complex mechanism for going to war. And then when you succeed in winning a war, you may be able to get some kind of concession out of the peace treaty. The Great War is going to be triggered potentially when the world tensions go up to 5. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this. I did a little bit of analysis here, because my feeling was, oh my God, the world tension stayed at 0 throughout the whole game, pretty much. It went up to 1 every now and then. And the French managed to conquer Belgium, the Netherlands, a couple of spaces in Germany. And I'm like, wow, that feels like that would probably be causing issues here, especially since they had flipped over their Napoleonic ambitions and Napoleon III was going out conquering stuff. Okay. I did a count, I may be wrong about this, but in the starting deck, there's 4 cards, and the deck is big to begin with. There are only 4 cards that'll increase the world tensions. And there's 1 card, I think, that'll decrease it. Some of these cards have a possibility of increasing it, so don't listen too much to this. Then new cards come in, not every turn, but in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th, I think. Well, only the last 2 add more cards that add to your world tension. So as the game progresses, the world tensions are going to tend not to keep climbing on their own, simply because the deck is getting bigger, and there just aren't all that many in the initial deck. In the 1890s, I think one additional card which increases world tension goes into the deck. But then, when you hit 1900, and there's 2 turns after these cards are added, 7 additional cards are added that can increase world tensions. And then there's a card which can decrease them by 1 or 2 points, depending on the circumstances. Players' own actions generally aren't likely to increase world tensions too much. The players don't really have a lot of reasons to be conquering other people's shit. And they may not particularly want to conquer minors. Now, that depends on how you look at things. They don't have national goals that align with that. But if they achieve the top of their territorial keys or whatever their goal, Russia has total keys, whatever. If they reach there for everyone but Britain, they get an auto victory. So you could engage in wars of conquest. And those kind of wars, those are the only ones that raise the national tensions. And not by a lot. It's not like in Pax Britannica, and I don't remember Europe in Turmoil all that much, so you'll have to forgive me there, but I've played a lot of Pax over the years. In Pax Britannica, every time you go to war, every time you get a conflict, every time something gets downgraded, a lot of events raise the tensions up. What's more is, while a war is going on, each turn that the war takes raises tensions by a couple of points. So if you fight in that game, no matter what the reason you're fighting, and it's all going to be colonial, which doesn't tend to raise tensions here, the world tensions are just going to keep rising. So however you want to look at that. Just making sure something said what I thought it did. You have this differentiation between standing and reserve armies. Your reserve armies, you can't put them on the board unless you're at war, and you actually have to spend wartime action points, which are different from your normal. They're related. You play a card when you first get involved in a war. That gives you a number of command points or whatever in order to operate within the war. That was a nasty sound. You have different kinds of forces. Some of them work better or only really work in the colonial combats, whereas others are your European combat pieces. You have naval units. There's 2 kinds of naval units. There's dreadnoughts, which come in late, and they are going to basically obsolete the old warships. But the old warships are still there. They just become half value when facing those. Rebel troops show up, whatever. All kind of stuff shows up through the chaos. I'm looking for something else. Here we go, right? Yeah. Okay. So on each of the player aids, there are a number of different tracks. The first one is the stability track. And this is important. It starts for most countries at 3. For all countries at 3? Yeah, the Brits are only at 3 to begin with. If you can get your stability up to 6, you get an additional card each turn. I wonder if I was doing that. I had shit tons of cards for most of the countries, so probably. If your stability falls below that starting 3, you start suffering penalties to your fighting capability, your victory points, and eventually even your cards. If your stability falls to 0 during the Great War, you're knocked out. It is actually how you determine sort of the national will in this game during the Great War. Your second track is manpower. This is a derived track. Your stability, it's going to go up and down due to events. A lot of players have home cards that allow them to force their stability up. Maybe they have to win a war to do it, but whatever. The manpower is going to determine how many troops you can have on the board during peacetime, and it's also a limit on how many reserves you can have. During the Great War, you can expend manpower to put more troops on the board. It stops having the same effect that it had in the main section of the game. But like I said, it's a derived value, and it comes from how many keys you have. And that could be different based on the different countries. So for example, the Germans here only get manpower off their territorial keys. Any colonial stuff doesn't give them any manpower. The Brits, as an example in opposition, and Turks kind of work with this, have two different manpower values. One for their colonial troops, which is basically their Indian forces until the Great War, when they can add one Commonwealth unit, and their home army. Industry tends to start relatively low. I think Britain starts with a little bit more than anyone else. This is how many cards you get each turn. And that's going to start out at a low value. You're guaranteed 3 cards no matter what, plus your home card. Even if you're, no matter what happens, what penalties you have, etc. But industry is basically your finances, what you're able to actually do. It gives you your fistful of cards. It's also going to serve as your limit, as in conjunction with manpower, the limitation to the number of reserve armies you can have, that you could build. Industry is also, in the Great War, going to determine how many command points you get, which is similar to cards. It's how big your economy is. Growing your industry is more complex than growing your stability. You basically have to play a card each turn that you want to grow your stability, and then make a die roll. You add the value of the card, and you have to roll a 5 or a 6 basically, but some countries are different. Down here, you track the different keys. Now, territorial keys have to connect back to your home country. Colonial keys are the ones that don't. Anything else exciting there? I don't know. The alliance system. I didn't really show the map all that well. By the way, the back is printed as well, but not in any usable way. But I'm just going to show you what some of the parts of the map look like. The alliance system is one of the things that's tracked on here. Down here. There are 2 alliances in the game, the Entente and the Triple Alliance. Those are the only options you have. You have to belong, you may only belong to one of them. There are no other, there's no other coalitions you can make that can fight or whatever. You're not going to be free to do what you want in general. At the beginning of the game, everybody starts out neutral. If you are in an alliance, you're not going to be allowed to attack anybody in the same alliance. You are allowed to call them into a war, and that might end up knocking them out of the alliance because they don't want to join. But yeah. The way the alliance system is managed in terms of moving around on there, some events allow you to just move on there. Sometimes even a choice. But most of it's done on here. And you're going to have 3 counters for your country on here. One for the Entente, one for the Alliance, one for neutral. You start off, everybody's got a point in neutral. That says, basically you have a, See, two words are coming to mind, momentum and lethargy. Neither one's the one I want. But they're both related. But my mind doesn't work properly anymore. And I feel like the word I want starts with an I. But anyway, sure you know what I'm talking about. I just can't find it because I'm getting old. But anyway, whichever alliance you're in at the beginning of a turn, basically, or whenever alliances are checked at the end of that, you're going to have 1 point in that. Cards can be used, and other things such as breaking alliances can affect this, to add points towards either alliance or towards neutrality. Fuck. It just sucks when you can't find words anymore. I hate being old. Anyway. Inertia. I knew it started with an I. I'm so proud of myself. Anyway. If only one of these, if there's a positive value in only one of the three options, whenever alliances are, whenever the alliance system is checked, you will move in that direction. So if you're moving towards the triple entente, if you're neutral, you move into the first box of the entente. If you're already one box in, you move to the second box. If you're already aligned with an alliance, the other alliance or neutral will have the same effect on you. And you'll move in that direction. However far you go in neutral, you can only stop at the neutral box. You won't go further towards an alliance. You and other players are allowed to spend the CPs, the ops points basically, to just put points in these for other players. Or for yourself. You do not have agency in the alliances you make. And this is important. There's a further rule. No more than 3 players can belong to any alliance. It's a 6-player game. This is meant to ensure a certain level of play balance, I think, in the Great War. It does have this weird effect where if there's someone that you want to pick on, you may just not be able to. Let's say there's 3 players in a certain alliance, and the guy you want to pick on is in the other alliance. You are not allowed to declare war on him because it would push you into something where 3 people are already allied. There are a couple of special cases, but they're not player controlled at all, where more than 3 players can end up in a single alliance. They're very specific special cases. Okay. The way this track works out is you basically roll a die and add your, well, if only one of the 3 options is a positive number, you'll automatically move 1 space in that direction. If more than one has a positive number, you have to roll 3 dice, 1 for each impetus, essentially, and you add however many points it has to it, even if that number of points is 0. And then the highest total is the direction you move in. If that highest total is big enough, you might move 2 spaces at once. We've already talked about the action cards. Again, there are reaction cards in there. There's also battle cards, essentially. But there's a separate deck of Great War cards, which are the only cards you're going to use in the Great War, and then there's your national goal cards, which are just, your secret goals for the game. All right. You start the game, you get your cards, you look at them, you start thinking about what you're doing. And then you're allowed to make diplomacy with the other players. But not this kind of diplomacy. You're able to cut deals. You can make any kind of agreements you like. You can agree to play a card. You can agree to do this, that, and the other. Nothing's binding. You can agree to give one another territory and or action cards. These are binding. Like most, maybe all of the Here I Stand based games, if you want to give somebody a card, you can't give them a specific card. You give them a draw from your hand. And it doesn't include your home card, but that's okay. After any diplomacy you make, any deals you cut, other agreements are non-binding, like, hey, I'll give you a card if you play that card, that specific card that I really want for me during your first action phase or whatever. That kind of deal. I didn't have anybody ever give anybody else a territory. No, can you give up things other than actual territories? Trying to remember. Thought you could give territories. Now I'm not seeing it here. Hopefully this made with it. Maybe not. Maybe that's only as part of a peace. A negotiated peace. Yeah. I don't see it here in the diplomacy. So I lied to you. All right. After the diplomacy, and you can have picked it before, but it's not in your hand. It won't get, you can't lose it. You get to pick one of your two home cards. And so you get the hand you were dealt plus a home card. Now, you may have also held a card beforehand from a previous turn. The action phase itself, you have a number of different things you can do. You can build forces, both land and naval. You can place influence or diplomacy. Again, influence allows you to try to get control of an unformed area. I'm going to call it that. Diplomacy gets you closer to making an ally with a minor. Only one person can have either of these in any space, so there's a capability to take it away from somebody. And these all have a command point cost. The card you play gives you X number of command points, and you can split them up and play them kind of as you wish, doing some of these actions more than once, doing different actions, whatever. Some of the actions are limited to only being done once, though. I think influence, for example, you can only play one. You can only take one influence. Taking away an influence card, you can only take away one. I know that. Pacification of an area that you've got troops in. This could be either an unformed or neutral area that you have an influence in and you're trying to switch it to a control. Or it could be an area that's kind of being trouble and you're not in control of it anymore, but nobody else is going to be able to slip in and sneak in there on you anyway. That's something you have to pay points to do. You can build forts. Forts are fucked up in this game. You buy a fort, and it's kind of like a military unit that doesn't move. That feels fair and everything, but the problem is at the end of each turn, your forts all degrade by 1 point. It costs a point to build a point of fort. And it costs a point to build a point of army. A point of army and a point of fort are about equal to each other in terms of military capabilities. The army can move. The fort may have some advantages in certain circumstances. Once you're out of armies, fine. but you will lose a level off of each fort you have in the game. The forts only go up to level 2, so it's not even like you can just build them up, to some high number, and I don't know. They can go up to level 3 under there's a special card that allows that. Sometimes your cards won't be big enough to do the things you want to do. So you have a CP chain counter, which allows you to to put a couple of cards in a row. I had issues with this where I forgot that I had a CP chain in place and ended up ignoring it and then doing something else, which isn't really allowed. I could play an event, I think, but if I play another card for points, I have to chain them together and use them. Whatever. Looking to see what else is there. That's the main meat of the game, is playing, your cards for points or for triggering the event. But one of the things you can do with a card, unlike most of these games where you can just hey, I'm next to you, we're not the same player, I'm going to attack you. Some of them may have some kind of alliance restrictions or something, but in general, everybody's considered opposed to each other, and they might just go out and attack each other and take each other's spaces, and then maybe spend a CP to convert them or not. In this game, instead, you have formal declarations of war, and I actually really like this because I feel like it certainly applies here. But I feel like even in the earlier games, take a look at Here I Stand as an example, the idea of one nation just being able to attack another for shits and giggles wasn't really applicable. You still had formal declarations of war, formal peaces, and all of that. Those games don't include that. They leave it up to the players to not be chaotic, to kind of agree, yeah, okay, we can keep a border here, we won't attack each other, you might still leave a garrison or whatever, but, But in this, you cannot attack someone else, or a minor, without a formal declaration of war. And if you want to make a formal declaration of war, you have to play one of your CP cards to do that. That generates. Now this is an important part of it. That generates the amount of command points you're going to have for that war. It means your wars are basically limited to no more than 4 points. There's no cards that are bigger than 4s, and you can't use a chain to go to war. To no more than 4 points. And that limits the size of the wars. Now this is actually why this works well in this, is that as opposed to other games that like Napoleonic Wars where you can shift the diplomacy, I think. I don't remember if you had to use CPs for that or ops points or whatever. But here, in this period, until the Great War, the wars tended to be pretty small things. Even the Crimean War wasn't that huge. The Russia-Turkey Wars, the Austro-Prussian, Austro-French, all Franco-Prussian, whatever you want to call it. All of these wars, not Austro-French, tended to be pretty small. Over within a year or so. And given that the turns are decades, even if they go over a year, it still fits well within the turn limit. So when you actually when you decide to go to war with someone, you have to declare what your aim for that war is. And in general, the only aim that's bad for world tensions is a conquest war. When you declare a war of conquest, the world tensions rises and you take a stability loss equal to the current world tension. There are some capabilities which reduce the penalty there for wars of conquest. For example, that French card I was talking about allows you to, and one of the two, it's either a French home card or their I think it's the Napoleon's Ambition. It doesn't hurt your stability. It still raises the world tension, but it doesn't hurt your stability because, I don't know, declaring war helps your stability under certain types of regimes. A war of liberation is kind of like a conquest war. If somebody else is sitting on your home territory, you're allowed to declare war on them without raising world tensions, without hurting your stability, and then you can fight them with the points, whatever. And you place war goals based on what your war aim is. And you're allowed up to 2 war goals. But they have to fit the type of space that you're going for. You could also do liberation wars for minor powers, for nationalities, etc. There's wars of unification. This is allowed only for Germany and Austria. Germany is trying to, well, Prussia. Prussia is trying to create Germany. Austria might be trying to incorporate more territory of nationalities they've granted citizenship to. They didn't historically do this, but it is an option that's available to them. And again, this doesn't cost you a WTT. This gives Austria, if they start, let's say they make the Poles their a citizenship group, this gives them an option to add a significant amount of territories to their territorial keys. So it gives them a pathway towards that automatic victory, for good or bad. It's also possible to declare a war of Italian unification, but there you're not trying to unify something yourself. You're trying to help the Italians unify. This is not necessarily a great idea. You might have an ally, and you will temporarily get an ally at least, in the War of Italian Unification, that you will lose once you unify Italy. You might still have an advantage on Italy, but in general, other people don't really want, oh fuck, my rule book's falling apart. Damn stapled rule books. I've had to flip through it a lot. That's the issue. So the gain for unifying Italy may seem not worth it. But Italy has its chance of unifying on its own. You're allowed to attack players or non-player powers. If you declare war on an ally of a player, that is the same as declaring war on the player. Your war aim is based on that ally, and that player is involved in the war. Allies who are minor powers who are declared war on are allowed, well, they automatically look for somebody to help them. Once you fight a war, it will result in a peace eventually. And the peace ends up giving you a truce where you're not allowed to go to war with that player for 1 or 2 turns. The actual fighting is pretty simple. When you're at war, you have a limited number of things you can do that kind of relate to the things you could do. Well, they kind of relate to the things you can do in your movement, in your actual turn. In your actual turn, I missed something key here. Let me look at the list here. So when you move boats, You have to move them space by space, and each space basically costs a CP, unless it's within Europe, in which case it costs you 1 to do it, and it's free within Europe. But if you want to move forces if you want to move land forces, you do a redeployment action that allows you to move all your forces around where you have a line of communication. When you get to the war phases, it costs you a CP to move boats, the same as back in the regular card play. But if you want to move land forces, you pay one of your CPs, one of the ones that you've gotten off the card that you declared war on, or if you're the defender, you play a card to give yourself wartime CPs, and you just get them off that. Cannot be a mandatory card, though. And this is one of the things, there are a number of things where it's like the consequences of what you've chosen to do aren't necessarily very apparent. Well, one of these is, if I'm just holding a mandatory card and another card that I want to hold for the end of the turn, and somebody attacks, well, let's say I'm just holding a mandatory card, and somebody attacks me, I cannot play that mandatory card to defend myself. It's the same as if I had no card at all, except that I look like I have a card. Anyway, that's just one of the things that I was like, oh shit, this really kind of screws up my day, because you generally want to hold a single card in case somebody attacks you. You're allowed to pass with 1 card in your hand. The Brits are allowed to pass with 2 in their hand, as long as none of them are mandatory or home cards. If you end up spending all your non-mandatory cards, then you don't have a defense if you're attacked. And that means you might be a sitting duck. You might not. You might have your troops positioned so that they work well. But if you want to move your units during wartime, for 1 CP, and everything basically costs 1 CP, you can move all your units 2 movement points. And most spaces cost 1 to move. Difficult terrain costs 2. Another thing you can use your movement points for is to put a pile of reserves on the board out of your reserve box. Another one you can spend a CP for is to do rail movement, which is based on your industry, and then you can move infinitely like a redeployment within your own territory. It also costs a single CP to fight a land battle from one space into another. You're not going to see a broad front of attacks all at once. This applies for the Great War too. So you actually don't see a lot of combat happening. And you kind of have to move your forces around and position them to get them ready for an attack, costing you a CP for the maneuver or whatever, and then another CP to make a single attack. And then if you want to make another attack, you have to wait till your next impulse, make another attack. All wars are handled in the same sort of pulsing situation where each player gets to do one thing. The Great War is a little different. There's a little bit of option to play an extra thing there. You win a war as the attacker by taking your wartime aims, the objective spaces you chose, or by taking the capital of your enemy. If you take the capital of your enemy, you've won a major victory, and you get to take 2 peace treaties things. But doing so is considered harsh terms that will raise the WTT, and it'll also increase the animosity between the 2 players. going to war with someone also pushes them into the other alliance camp. But if you take harsh conditions, you push them again, and you push yourself. If you don't manage as the attacker to get your war aims, then the defender, if they occupy any space initially controlled by the attacker or blockade the attacker, wins the war and gets a treaty concession for it. Now, players can agree to negotiate a peace, and here they're allowed to concede a treaty option again. Yeah, no, you can't give territories away. Thought you could in this one. Can in most of them. Or maybe I just didn't see it. Because I thought it was there before when I was playing. I never used it. Both people can make an agreement, and this will give a single treaty to the person who wins the war by agreement. Another option is both people can agree, screw it, this war wasn't worth it, let's have a white peace. And then there are no treaty options. This also happens if the war comes to an end and neither player has CPs left or wishes to use their CPs or whatever, and the war aims haven't been taken and the defensive victory doesn't exist. It is possible to take a treaty option from somebody, from an ally to the major belligerent that you knock out of the war. This is going to be another player, not a minor power or whatever. And the treaty options can be a territorial session, always doing this, in which case spaces that you targeted become yours. And a single treaty option can take both war aims that you claimed. But in order to win the war, you have to have captured both the war aims or taken the capital. There are a number of other things. You can change the alignment of minor powers in the game. You can demand reparations, which is going to be a card. The defender is able to take a space that they conquered during the war. They don't have to have war aims. If they take a space and they won the war, i.e. the war aims weren't achieved, they're able to get their advantage there. You can cede colonies in this. Those do not require, how do they define this? Yeah, anything that's a colonial key. So you could take something that's, like Greece. Like if Britain somehow has control of Greece, you could take that away from them. Because that would count as a colonial key for them. And then if you had a white piece, you get a one-turn truce. Anything other than that will give you a two-turn truce. And that truce prevents those two players from going to war with each other. Now, the one-turn truce is just the current turn. Combat, anyway, and then the forces demobilize. You check to see if a blockade is there. This could be an important thing, and I didn't use this as much as I probably should have. If you're able to blockade your enemy at the end of the war, you give them a -1 card. You could, of course, work into a negotiations that you don't apply the blockade on them after the war and maybe get a better condition out of that somehow. Battles themselves are done from one space into an adjacent space, and you count the strength of the units in the two spaces that are directly fighting, and then the strength of supporting units, which have to be adjacent to one of those two spaces. You roll on a fairly simple table. The advantage goes to the attacker. They win ties, and both sides take losses. If the advantages are large enough, you could get a decisive victory, which allows you to basically either attack again from that space or move those units, which could conquer territory. Boats are kind of complicated in this. They work more like, well, they work like boats do in most of these games, but there's no interception or anything like that going on in the movement that happens during regular combat movement, which is like 2 movement points, right? There's no interception. There's no zones of control, anything along those lines, and there is no withdrawal from ground combat. But navies have interception and withdrawal rules, making them more in line with most of the here I stand type stuff. The battles themselves are handled on the same table as the ground battles, but they work a little different. You have retreats. So the losing player in a battle in either case retreats, but in a land battle, you're just kind of giving up the space you're in and fall back onto the next space. In the naval battle, you have to go back to a port, I think. No, could be an adjacent naval box as well. Let me see. Special rules for sailing your ships into a port to attack it. I didn't do that. Amphibious assaults are going to be a land battle action. It costs you 1 CP. Now, when you do a naval move at any point, either within a war or outside of the war, you can take 1 land unit with you. It doesn't have to be with you. You can take 1 land unit. And that is most of the main part of the game. The end phase has a few things. You get militarization or militarism, which allows you to say, I don't want to lose a point off this fort, so you can keep 1 fort alive, at its current strength without degrading. So if you've got an incredibly important fort, you can spend every turn to do that, your militarism advantage. But if you don't do that, you get to build an extra step of army each turn. The non-player powers get their armies as well rebuilt. At this point, you check your territorial keys to see what your manpower changes to. It doesn't change until the end of the turn. Industrialization, this is when you make your die rolls for any cards you've committed to that, to see if you gain your thing. If anybody's, trying to declare independence, it progresses at this point. A whole bunch of cleanup type stuff. But there's an important thing here. Conduct an alliance. Oh, yeah. You roll for these at the end of each turn. It's possible that a card might make you roll for it as well during the midst of a turn, and there's actually 2 of those cards, so you could roll 3 times in every turn. But world tension goes down by 1 every turn. This is part of why it's almost impossible for it to get above about 1, because people don't want to do wars of conquest. The only thing that costs world tension, if the world tension is high, because they pay a stability cost on it. There aren't a lot of cards which drive it up. It's going to go down by 1 each turn. And people's goals generally aren't in favor of wars of conquest anyway. So tensions stay mild. But they can ramp up once the deck gets filled with those late cards, the 1900 card, the last 2 turns. On 3 of the turns of the game, you get to draw 3 of these random national goals, and you pick one. Italy and Poland conform into nations. Okay. Let's start talking about the Great War now. Yeah, I know, I'm taking forever here. I always seem to. We didn't even really talk about how Italy forms. They have a random table, and when the Italian card comes out, things happen. And those things that happen may be an attempt to unify. That did not happen in my game. They never really made a serious attempt at it. But it can happen all of a sudden. Poland has a card as well. Now, the Polish card isn't mandatory, which means somebody has to play that card. I don't think it is. Somebody has to play that card, give up the points for it to trigger an event that tries to make Poland ugly. One of the things with this game and many of the games of this type is that anything that you do that hurts another player, it's going to piss off that other player, probably something you don't really want to do unless they're in the lead. And you're giving up a card that's good for you. It's at least good for you for the points, right? Even if the event isn't good. Even if you don't have an option to use the event that's good. So you don't really want to use an event to hurt somebody in general. And some people don't tend to do that. If it were a two-player game, you would be constantly hitting each other with bad events like you do in something like Twilight Struggle. But in these Here I Stand games in general, you're trying to pad your own victory points and do the things you want to do. Now, it may come to the point where you have a card that's not worth a hell of a lot, and it hurts somebody a fair amount. It seems like a good idea, sure. But in general, it's not worth pissing people off. Especially, unless you assess that they're in the lead. Or that you want to beat them up in a war or something, and you're trying to soften them up for that. You might, make them discard a card or something. Okay. When the world tension hits 5, when it hits 3, nobody can declare any wars anymore. When it hits 5, and that's players, minors, anything, you can't declare on any of them. When it hits 5, you immediately enter this crisis situation where you roll on this table, you get some narrative out of it, you might get some changes where minor powers are actually getting involved in the war. And any players who are part of an alliance are dragged into the war. Other players might be dragged in by that table. It's possible. At least 2 players will be at war. And then you go through a sequence where you get these different cards. Your hand of cards goes away. Much of what's happening in the game just stops happening. You're not interested in stuff like influence, for example, or diplomacy or anything like that. Those can all be pulled away. But the first turn of the Great War is turn 0. That's going to represent the mobile phase of the war. And the first thing you do a number of things, but one of the things you do there is you score all your national goals there. You find out how many victory points you had, and that is going to give you a bonus in the war. That's going to give you a bonus that you can apply to either stability, manpower, or industry. You can get up to 3 bonuses for it. You might also get some elite core. And I don't remember what the national will step is. Oh yeah, that's the bonus for that. And then the players collectively from each of the alliances decide what order they're going to go in. And the 2 alliances are going to alternate. There will always be as many turns for each of the alliances. If the number of players differs, there's some wild card turns the alliance that didn't get to go gets to use. They don't have to use them, though. They can always pass during the wildcard turns. Okay. Then each player gets a single Great War card. They get their war budget, which is basically their industry value, possible modifiers. And they're allowed to hand up to one command point to an ally that they have a line of communications to. Then each player can do one point of stuff, and that point of stuff is very much like the wars. Once everybody's passed or is out of points or whatever, you go to a winter step where essentially there's some bookkeeping type stuff, and the colonial areas get a die roll off to see who wins the colonial wars there. You could commit your CPs to fight in the colonial wars, but you need not. Key point here is you're no longer going to be using the main deck at all. Countries like Italy and the US might end up joining in the war eventually. Minor powers don't join the war unless one of those Great War cards is played that brings them in. There's only 10 of those cards, I think, and there's 6 players. They each get a card. Even neutrals will get a card. They'll have an opportunity to play that. Those Great War cards. So normally you'll be able to spend 1 CP like you were able to in the wars that happened in the main part of the game. But you could play your Great War card for an additional CP and do 2 points of actions in a single impulse. And that can be very, very powerful. That might knock somebody out of the game to do that. Or you could play that card in conjunction with the CP that you play in order to trigger the event on the card. And then some of them are also like battle cards, which you can use outside of that mechanism as a battle. The cards can be very powerful. They can bring a minor power into play with a couple of armies. They, trying to think what else. I don't know. You can bring the US into play, but that sounds similar. They can force an enemy to conduct an offensive. And now combat works differently here. Well, in Great War Turn 0, combat works a lot like it does in the main battle game. Once you hit Great War Turn 1 and later, you start having trench warfare. And trench warfare is painful. The attacker takes an additional hit when they fight. And a victory brings you into the same space as the guy you attacked, doesn't drive him out of it, and you can both attack each other. It's similar in a lot of other ways. On Great War Turn 0, forts give you an additional ability to avoid retreats. They're kind of like trenches for 1 turn. Everything is considered entrenched that's in a key. Most of the areas in Europe are keys, but there are some things like the Caucasus that aren't. I don't know, that's not really Europe. I think there's some areas in Russia as well, maybe in Austria, that will not be entrenchable ever. After everybody's played their their Great War actions, not cards, they've spent all their actions or passed or whatever, then you check for a blockade. If somebody's blockaded at this point, they end up losing a point of industry. Whenever you take so there's a number of different things that actually impact your stability in a Great War. The one that I saw most commonly was you take a territory that the other player owns, and they lose a stability. If you're retaking a territory you lost, you gain a stability for that. Some of the cards can cost stability. A decisive victory can cause a stability loss. Losing dreadnoughts causes a stability loss. And the UK and Russia losing colonial wars in some cases causes stability loss. You're like, I don't need stability. What do I care about that? If your stability reaches 0 in the Great War, you lose the war and you surrender. And you're just gone. If your stability gets low, you start getting a battle modifier, and I completely forgot about that. Oops. People who were on the low end, they generally ended up losing the wars because somebody could capture territory. And this is one of the issues I had with it was, you wanted to defend all your territory in the real Great War. It was hard to make that shift in my mind. And my brain just couldn't make it that I need to defend everything. And instead I tried to defend key areas more than everything, and ended up letting things turned really chaotic with countries just surrendering left and right. And it felt completely wrong and ahistorical. But it's my fault. However, the countries who were on the ropes and had their territories taken, to a large extent, wouldn't have been able to defend everything. So I don't know. Each country has its pile of national special rules, some of which are on those, most of which are on those things, but some of them are not, and you'll have to look shit up. Some of them are baked into the rules, some of them are just in this area. The rulebook as a whole had one problem that it has a fair amount of problems, but it had, you know, because obviously if it has 8 pages of errata, it had a fair amount of problems. Even given the errata, I found at least one thing that was a mistake as far as I can tell. I found a couple of ambiguities, a couple of places where until I knew the cards were ambiguities. And but it also has this tendency to write everything once, and not necessarily in the place you decide to look for it. And although the game has an index at the back of the rolls, the index is structured very much like a table of contents. There is a table of contents as well, a huge and very good table of contents. The index itself has one entry page for each thing. Each thing that's an entry in the index has only one page for it. It's not everywhere it's mentioned. It doesn't include anything that's not sort of a table of contents type level thing. The index was just misdone. It is not a reasonable index, especially given that there's already a very good table of contents. I was not happy about the chaos that I saw in the game that I played. I didn't like that. I mean, it was funny to watch, but it felt like in too many cases I just felt like I didn't know what was going to happen. Things were shocking me that I didn't think should have, and it just, you know, it felt very chaotic, and I spoke of it as reminding me a lot of something like Cosmic Encounter, a very random, you know, a game where you can't tell what the hell's going on or not. I don't think the game is that way. I think once you sort of master playing it, it's not going to feel like that. But I think your first play or two is very likely to feel that way. And if you come back to it later, after, you know, being away from it for a couple of years or something, I think it's going to feel that chaos again. Like, it's not something that's just going to stick in your head, because concepts of the way the combat works, and most especially, and this feels really weird to me, sorry, I'm trying to molest the battery, the way that alliance system works, where you can't make alliances at will, where you're restricted from them, and where, oddly enough, other people are able to put points in and drive you in directions you don't want to go. That has a whole huge set of like impacts that can really feel confusing and baffling, and you just feel like you're being battered back and forth by the game. Add to that this hugely complex game state. It's not the most complex game state that I've seen, but it's enough of one that it induced errors, you know? And, you know, maybe I'm just bad at keeping track of stuff. Maybe you're a lot better. If you found things like Virgin Queen, for example, to be really easy the first time, hey, maybe you won't have a problem with this the way I did. But I had a big problem understanding what the implications were of, you know, certain moves and whatnot. Had a lot of cases where I would see something and be like, oh, I can just walk in there. And in fact, the game ended with the most powerful country, France. They were probably going to lose anyway. But I just did not realize that they had a couple of territories that they had taken. They had taken much earlier. They had taken to try to hurt Turkey and drive Turkey's stability down. Well, they had to abandon those spaces more or less. And then they were taken from them and ended up knocking them out of the war in a situation where I didn't think it was possible to do so. Similarly, I left the Russians. They left St. Petersburg open, and a Lord Fisher type expedition, because the Russians and Germans were allied, ended up going in, grabbing St. Petersburg, and because the Brits had one of those Great War cards, I could march all the way to Moscow in the same impulse, and I could knock the two Russian capitals out, and they surrendered. It's very... Am I wrong about that? Now I'm like, Jesus, did I just... I hope I didn't get this wrong, that in the Great War, that if your capital is captured, you surrender immediately. And now I'm like, wait a minute, is that true? I just have this feeling of like, maybe there's a year that you're not. Like maybe you have an impulse to try to get it back or something. I don't think so. Stability and elimination, that's not going to be what it is. Surrender and elimination, I would... This is where I have problems with the rules. So there's a section, surrender and elimination, and that is where it should tell me what I'm looking for. but it's just giving me the effects of surrendering. And capital is not in the index. This is why the rulebook's falling apart, because I've had to, well, first of all, it's a stapled together one with modern glossy paper that falls apart more easily, but that's a different thing. Let me take a look at capitals. Capitals and subcapitals. Capitals are represented. Subcapitals only matter during the Great War. Okay, it gave me the rule for that, 30.1. Okay. It's the rule I was looking at. A player immediately surrenders when the stability reaches 0 or if their capital is occupied. No, I did it right. Okay. I'm just making sure. And countries with a subcapital, it's got to be both. So yeah, I just had this worry of, oh my God, the chaos that I saw wouldn't have happened if, like, you had a turn to regain your capital. Maybe. Nah, it would have still happened. Because you would have to move to next to your capital with armies, and then launch an attack. So, I mean, the conjunction was that naval invasion in St. Petersburg and the fact that you can take a double impulse by using your card, which, you know, it just doesn't feel like, it's just not something that feels normal to me in games. All right, we're done.